The story of Israel, part 3, where things get interesting and relevant to our time. So we finished the last part in 1929. Israel is inhabited mainly by 800,000 Muslims and 200,000 Jews. Many on both sides migrated only in the last century. After the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the British now control Israel, and they show their intention of granting the inhabitants future independence. The Arabs, who were used to being superior and privileged in the eyes of the government, didn't like the thought of those dhimmis, those second-class Jews, getting their own country. So they revolted. During the rebellion, in Germany, Hitler's rise to power was completed by 1934, and many frightened Jews ran off to a much safer Israel. These newcomers purchased lands and joined the Jewish workforce in developing the infrastructure of a proper state. This enhanced the resentment of the Arabs who felt left out. Again, in their eyes, 20 years earlier, Jews didn't have the legal rights to do any of that, and that made the Arabs very angry. In 1936, in an attempt to please the Arabs, the British assembled the Peel Commission, which recommended the following steps. 1. Splitting Israel to an Arab state in 80% of the land, Jewish state in 17% of the land, and a small British corridor from Jerusalem to the sea. 2. Forcing the Jewish state to financially support the Arab state. 3. Significantly limiting the Jewish migration and the rights to purchase lands effective immediately. This was the first time someone came up publicly with a partition plan, and even though they got a small fraction of the land, some Jewish leaders accepted the terms. Under the threat of total annihilation, all they wanted was a safe place for Jews, even if it's tiny and surrounded by enemies. And speaking of enemies, you want to know how the Arabs responded to this generous offer? Listen to Ahmad Suleiman, the official spokesman of the Arab nations. Every man who accepts this offer will be outcast from the Arab world and will enrage the wrath of the Muslims. A year later, the Arab High Committee assembled in Syria and issued an official statement against the establishment of any Jewish state in the area. They were offered 80% of the land plus financial aid, but they refused. They refused because they didn't accept the idea of any Jewish state. And that is the main theme we experience until this day. A 100-year conflict is ongoing because there are two sides. One side is willing to share for the sake of peace, while the other side wants everything or war. And then World War II started, and the British, who needed more fighting force, recruited 30,000 Jews who were eager to fight the Nazis. But the British wanted Arab support as well. So in an attempt to reconcile the Muslim world, they issued the famous White Paper of 1939, which declared a plan to establish one state in the whole of Israel with an Arab majority, while also shutting down the gates to Jewish refugees who wanted to flee the Nazis. And despite all that, the Jews stood by the British side. As the Jewish leader David Ben-Gurion said, "We shall fight the war against Hitler as if there was no White Paper, and we shall fight the White Paper as if there was no war." And what about the Arab leader? Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini actually met Hitler and joined the Nazi side. Are you with me so far? Good, because as the war ended in 1945, things got a bit complicated. 2/3 of the Jewish population in Europe died during the Holocaust, and many of the survivors, who lost their entire families, were desperate to run away to the one place they feel safe in. But the British, who still wanted to please the Arabs, didn't let any Jew into Israel. Imagine losing everyone you know in the concentration camps, miraculously surviving, finally onboarding a refugee ship, only to be stopped and turned back right before reaching safe haven. In some cases, refugees were actually shot dead by British soldiers. There were many ships with this tragic ending, and my great-grandfather had died on one of them. It's not surprising that the Jews in Israel were furious. They were promised the state by the British, they fought alongside the British, they died for the British, but now the British deport and kill them, completely forgetting the Balfour Declaration. So some of the Jews revolted as well, blowing up bridges and railways. In response, the British arrested or exiled 3,000 Jewish political leaders. But the Jews didn't stop, until eventually in 1947, the British simply gave up and handed over the mandate to the newly formed UN, who was now responsible to find a solution to the 600,000 Jews and 1.2 million Arabs in Israel. The solution and everything that's happened since in part 4.